Turning from domestic life, and talk a little bit about church life. Some of the things that we're talking about here we've emphasized already, but things like mandatory church attendance, especially early on in the colony. Even if you weren't a church member, you still had to be a church goer. And in all of this, the ministers had a lot of authority. And there was a lot of respect people had for ministers, even though that priesthood of all believers was a common Puritan belief. The Puritans, like other Protestants, believed in two sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper. There were some Puritans that rejected the idea of infant baptism, but most Puritans believed in infant baptism, and we talked about that a little bit on Monday. And infant baptism for the Puritans involved commitments by the parents and the church to prepare the new child. It brought them into the community, and the parents would instruct them. These are the kind of promises being made. The Lord's Supper was held periodically. It wasn't a very frequent practice among the Puritans. And usually it would take place after a regular service. So you would have the regular service, and then only church members stayed after to take the communion, a closed communion service. Only certain people able to participate. The Puritans used a communion table rather than the altar of Catholicism and Anglicanism and the Mass. The Puritans tended to believe in the real presence of Christ, but of course they didn't believe in transubstantiation. Right? Christ's presence is in the bread, it's in the wine, but it's still bread, it's still wine. All the elected officials in Puritan colonies had to be church members, and so they participated in it, but a minority of churchgoers participated. Very few church members in Puritan New England. At the center of New England towns were the meeting houses. It was really usually the only public building in a town or a village. And as soon as a town was incorporated, they made plans for building a meeting house. In the center of town, usually on an elevated ground and equidistant from the surrounding houses. The center, it brought the focus. There were 220 meeting houses constructed in the 17th century, 2,000 more in the 18th. As one scholar of Puritan New England has said, they proclaimed to everyone, these meeting houses, proclaimed to everyone that religion was the highest priority. And it sits in the center, it sits high above. There were very few differouses between the meeting houses and common houses with respect to architecture. They tended to be roughly hewn log buildings like regular homes. They tended to be cold, dark in their interior, not a lot of light, with the traditional horizontal pews facing a pulpit or maybe even a desk. Some people refer to the meeting houses as the Lord's barn, just because it had that kind of barn-like feel. Also very important for Puritan church life were the sermons. The sermons essentially were the central ritual of social order for Puritan New England. We've already emphasized how important the communication of the word was to Protestants. And this was especially true in Puritan New England. Even as Puritanism kind of dies out and begins to change into some other things in American history, these high levels of literacy in New England continued to remain. Puritans read their Bible and probably not much else. I mean, that was the highlight, the hallmark of Puritan society. Ministers, however, often had libraries filled not only with Bibles, but commentaries, concordances, works of theology, works on the culture of the ancient Near East. They were expected to be very well-educated people. Another thing about the sermon was that it was really the only regular mode of public communication. There wasn't other services or other types of systems in Puritan New England to get messages out. And so the sermon kind of served, excuse me, for religious purposes. It served educational purposes, but it could also serve to get the news out. So it had that kind of journalistic function as well. For a lot of Puritans, the sermon protected society from outside or ungodly forces. And as sermons developed over the colonial period, they spoke to all areas of life. They touched on everything. And in the early years of the colonies, only ministers were allowed to speak on important public occasions. So the minister had a lot of authority. They were the ones to provide social direction. Ministers were expected to visit, to tutor the youths, and sometimes even farm their own land because of the low salaries, in addition to preaching. The preaching of the Puritans tended to follow a very similar format, kind of a three-part structure. The first part would be related to a specific scripture, and it would be an explanation of the text, right? The general meaning. What is this text about? The second part of the sermon would be drawing out the doctrines or principles found in the text, right? So you're reading a text, let's say David and Goliath, and you're just kind of explaining what's going on in this passage in 1 Samuel 17. And then the second part would be, what kind of principles or doctrines can we pull out of this story? Right? You know, maybe something like the power of God, or trusting in God, or something like that. And then the third section was the application section. How do I apply this in my daily life? And so you start off by explaining the text, drawing out the doctrines, and then applying it to the life of the person hearing you. And that was the standard format. That's what nearly all Puritan sermons were like. In fact, a lot of ministers often preached sermon series. They might focus on a specific text or chapter or book for several weeks or months at a time, because it would help them focus their preparation, because they had to speak several times a week. And so if you're trying to, I'm going to preach on grace in the morning, and I'm going to preach on the book of Revelation at night, and you know, you could get kind of confusing. But if you're focusing on a text, right, working through, often verse by verse, you know, it'd be a lot easier to prepare. In Puritan New England, there were regular sermons and there were occasional sermons. Regular sermons were the standard services held throughout the week, no matter what. 2 times on Sunday, and often once during the week. So 2 to 3 times during the week. Most of the sermons tended to be 1 to 2 hours in length. So if you have problems sitting through a 25-minute one, you really would have a problem in Puritan New England. Henry Stout, who is a scholar of Puritan England sermons, estimates that there were 5 million Puritan sermons during the colonial period, for a population that never got bigger than 500,000, and whose largest city never got over 17,000. The average weekly church goer would have heard 7,000 sermons at around 15,000 hours in their life. That's a lot. The focus of the regular sermon was on salvation. Right? So the 2 to 3 times a week, those sermons were about salvation. Show people how terrible sin is. Show them the answer to sin, right? Talk about salvation, talk about Jesus. And then encourage them to live lives of service. And so largely that would be how they would approach the text. Individuals, of course, would vary. Maybe some would focus on the sin part of it, or focus more on salvation. But that was generally the focus of the sermon in those 3 parts. In addition to the regular sermons were the occasional sermons. At various times during the week or a month, when there was some special occasion, a minister would be called upon to offer a sermon related to a specific event. Those sermons tended to not be focused on individual salvation, but tended to be focused on social order, right? Maintaining order in society. A reminder of why did our Why did we come to New England? What's our purpose in being this kind of people? Now, for the Puritans, salvation was based on grace, not on works. You couldn't be justified by the things you did. God had to extend His grace to you. But the occasional sermons tended to emphasize works. Obedience to God's Word brought social blessings on the community. It didn't bring salvation, but it brought social blessings. So if the people in society were good, God would bless the community. And so in these cases, ministers kind of acting as the social guardians. It's not just about salvation, it's about social order. There would be sermons on fast days, FAST days, right? Days where people would fast. They would abstain from eating. Often these days were called by the civil authorities, which might be something locally, it might be across the colony, but everybody was expected to participate. Normal activities would cease, and you would gather at the meeting house. Often these were called in response to things like drought, mass disease, war, an earthquake, or something terrible has happened, and so we need to spend some time focusing. Because often those kind of things were looked upon as God's judgment. Right? God is judging the community. Something's wrong. So we need to gather, call for God's favor. And so the minister was kind of responsible for diagnosing the problem. What's the spiritual problem that's led to this? And what do we need to do about it? The alternative, of course, would be the days of Thanksgiving. Something wonderful has happened. Right? We've won a war. There's been some sort of great deliverance. We've escaped sickness. But often in those sermons, the reminder was, it's God who brings about deliverance, not human beings. One special day that was observed every year was the election sermon. In May, the free white men throughout New England would gather to vote on representatives to assemblies. There were other elections that took place, and the day culminated in a sermon. Usually the focus of the sermon was that reminder of the New England mission. Why are they there in New England? Things like covenant, and the errand that they have, the ideals of the colonies. By the middle of the 1650s, the sermons that Puritans offered started to change. Now, while we've talked about, here are these Puritans in Massachusetts. There were a lot of Puritans that stayed in England. And during the Civil War, the Puritans are the one coming to power, right? Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector, Puritan. The people in New England think, perfect. We've been looking for this opportunity to demonstrate this is the way to go. We have our brothers and sisters, our Puritan brothers and sisters in power. They are going to follow our way, right? Our New England way, our congregational way. And that's what they're going to establish. But they didn't. Right? So here are these Puritans that have this opportunity to establish this in New England, in Old England. Because a lot of those New England people still thought of themselves as English, still thought about returning to England. But the Puritans during the Protectorate don't follow their path. Well, a lot of the people in New England look upon this as rejection. And so a lot of the sermons at the time spoke of them being a rejected people. So they pull passages from the prophets that talk about Israel being an outcast or a rejected people. And they would connect to those passages. And this rejection was not due to their own failure to live up to the covenant, but to others failing to see how important the covenant was. Now, by the 1650s, a lot of the founders had started to die off. There were some still left, though. And those founders that were still alive often had this very mythic past about those original founders. That kind of memorialized them and really held them up to a high esteem, especially in those occasional sermons. Right? Those times where the people would be talking about society and the mission. That first generation would just be held up to that high standard because of their faithfulness to the covenant, to the mission. And so these sermons passed those myths on to the children, with this obligation to live up to these near impossible standards. They were encouraged to be the Solomons to the founders David. So David, just like Solomon followed his father David, that's kind of how they were encouraged to be. Part of this is reflected in the development of Harvard College. Harvard College was founded to train ministers as a way to kind of ensure the respectability of ministers and maintaining social order. It becomes very important. In the 1660s, for example, 85% of ministers in Puritan New England of that second generation had trained at Harvard. But there are these concerns that start developing of spiritual decay. We talked about this the other day with the halfway covenant, right? These second generation not having these conversion experiences. So by the later 1660s, a lot of ministers start focusing more on tracking down and suppressing heresy, like the Quakers. The occasional sermons start emphasizing threats of failure instead of the promise of success. As well as in that second and third generation, ministers are starting to lose their authority because there are social changes going on. More merchants, more market economy, those kind of things. Ministers kind of lose some of their authority. Because one of the things is, in this later generation, the ministers are young men in their 20s and 30s that have grown up with the congregation. Right? It's not these older men that would have been respected because of the age as well as their position. And so there's less respect for ministers because I grew up with that guy. I know what he's really like. Or, just a general concern about the ministry as well. King Philip's War in 1675 especially served as a source of concern and fears of spiritual decline. Failures to succeed were due to failures to live up to the covenant. And so more and more Puritan sermons in that latter part of the 17th century are these stories of decline, spiritual decline. Massachusetts Bay lost its charter in 1684. The colony and all of New England colonies came under the control of the Crown and the Anglican Church. The Crown enforced the Toleration Act, passed in 1689, which meant that religious tolerance became the code of law for all non-Anglican Protestant groups, including Quakers and Baptists, who the Puritans didn't particularly like. Eventually, Massachusetts Bay would get a new charter in 1692 under the leadership of Governor William Phips, who we talked about on Monday. But a lot of the previous freedoms and rights that they had were gone. Questions about Puritan domestic life or Puritan church life? Well, speaking about Phips and 1692 brings us back to witchcraft and the world of wonders. And thinking about the ways in which a lot of people in the 17th century looked at witchcraft and magic and the occult and alchemy and astrology, all sorts of things like that, as a source of power. A lot of people during that time did not see magic and Christianity as being incompatible. These were two components that could be used together, intertwined. What's particularly telling is that there have survived lists that people kept of their personal libraries. Now, obviously, these are people who could afford to have a personal library, so it would have been more prominent people. And not just New England, but in other colonies as well. In the list of their personal libraries, after religious books, they had books on the occult, magic, astrology, other types of things. Even ministers had books on the occult, and not just books that condemned occult motives. They had books about these kind of things. An example of this interest and the prevalence of this interest are the almanacs of the 17th century. In some places, almanacs outsold the Bible and were consistently the #1 non-religious book in the colony. Okay, what's that have to do with anything? Well, the almanacs at the time provided astronomical information that was useful for astrological calculations. Right? So it provided information about the location of the stars and other spatial bodies. that people would then use to make decisions based off of astrology. These almanacs would also include pictures of the human body, usually male, that were segmented according to the signs of the zodiac. Right? And so the certain signs, Pisces, Sagittarius, Aquarius, Leo, were connected with different parts of the body. And so if it was a certain time of year and a certain house sign with stars were in a certain house, and if you had an illness in this thing, this is what you would do. And so people use this information to determine when to plant, when to get married, when to try to have children, with the assumption that the stars were all aligning properly. These are Christians. Right? They're identifying, these are Puritans going to these 2 to 3 sermons a week. But they think that these two things are compatible. The occult, like astrology, could be understood as the ways of God working. It's not the exclusive way, right? God also works through the Word, and God works through the Spirit, but God also works through the stars for a lot of people. And it became a way for the common men and women to take control of their own religious experience outside of the minister and the official control that the minister had. It helped them make sense of and try to understand the world, why certain things happened to people and certain things didn't. Well, it's because the stars were aligned this way, and that's why this disease developed. And so, even though we just got done talking about this kind of strict Puritanism, right, and very focused on the Bible, people often kind of mixed and melded their practices as they thought was fit. Even some of the clergy. A lot of the clergy said, don't do this stuff, it's of the devil, this will draw you away from the Bible, from the church. A lot of people thought these things as compatible, work together. Questions, comments? All right, so we'll finish there with the 17th century. We'll pick up on Monday in the 1700s. And thinking now as we're moving into the 17th century, the 1700s to 18th century, the second generation, or the second century now, after some of the things of the Reformation. So we'll pick up with that on Monday.